So why do so many people accept some form of divine command theory then and stop asking questions? More authority does make social sense. When a father yells at a child to get out of the way of a moving vehicle or something analogous in prehistoric contexts, it is not the time for the child to ask, "Why should I think you know anything about physics, biology, and basic human needs?" It is not hard to understand why the children who just listened and got out of the way would tend to stay safer, having benefited from the parents' more developed understanding of the world. Children like that and more like that would tend to live to reproduce another day. Hence, in terms of human evolution, it is easy to understand why we might have an inherited mental bias for authority which works similarly in adulthood with religious and political leaders. People who tended to work well in groups without too much fuss reaped the benefits of the principle "together we stand, divided we fall." An authoritarian voice in the mix is the one that gave the group direction, and people working together had a better chance of surviving to reproduce than even more intelligent lone wolf individuals who were more inclined to rely only on themselves. Normal authoritarian psychology, as social tribalistic beings adapted to gravitate in groups towards a leader more or less uncritically, predisposes one to be disinterested in and or feel guilty for asking sufficiently critical questions here. Your feelings are designed, that is, incidentally contrived by natural selection working on cooperating social animals, to be at odds with exactly these kinds of questions, because asking a bunch of potentially undermining questions practically gets in the way of easily directed group cohesion. Note, and presumably any god who may have created our human psychology would have had a similar practical concept in mind. This is true of people encultured in authoritarian religions, authoritarian families, authoritarian tribes, and authoritarian cultures generally. Authoritarian psychology is a big part of the human condition with or without any version of theism, but theism traditionally makes ready use of this standard cognitive bias and can do so in the extreme. And without this preset in our social psychology, most theists would likely more easily notice that an authority is only as good as the independent quality content of the commands, and not be so quick to stack all their philosophical chips on the brute fact that a so-called moral command has been given from some source they happen to be impressed with. And they wouldn't be so inclined to pull rank in debate with those who clearly don't share their Christian brand of biases. Who are you to judge God Almighty? It's just not that surprising that most people's entire ethical theory is the simplistic moral sense that goes with "God said so." Most of the time, people are merely raised in the authoritarian environment where the authorities who happen to be in power are taken for granted as such. Most people who would never dream of challenging whatever authorities that they are used to never engaged in rigorous philosophical analysis of the general quality commands in the culture and in whether or not their given authority deserves to be the authority. Everyone else was listening to the apparent authority in their midst, so why shouldn't they? However, in a world full of competing moral authorities and moral ideas generally, that authority has to be reasonably demonstrated before we start giving the benefit of the doubt on difficult and less certain matters. Humanity has to collectively work on growing up here. Meanwhile, individuals can mature. For the sake of one's own integrity, and also for the sake of any hapless bystander that one wishes to persuade to follow similar suit. And one imagines that if there happens to be only one authority stranded with you on a desert island, it might be prudent to ask at some point about whether or not this person or persons actually knows what they're talking about before hopping in their proverbial submarine made of coconuts. Especially if your entire religious culture is getting ready to hop into their fleet of coconut spaceships that have yet to be tested prior to afterlife liftoff. Plenty of perceived divine authorities get inappropriately established in the form of non-existent gods simply not being obviously around and letting believers fill in the blanks however they want for millennia. Plenty of gods Christians don't believe in have satisfactorily established their divine credibility in this meaningless way. And surely the vast majority of those theists reflexively treat any challenges to that relatively arbitrary authority of theirs as having a disproportionately huge burden of proof to meet in order to overturn the validity and soundness of that run-of-the-mill, taken-for-granted authority. People need to deeply notice that such a burden of proof was never required of that authority to establish itself in the first place. And here we are with all of these theistic religions over the ages because of these plainly insufficient standards of evidence to establish them. Otherwise, why aren't all of our senses of authority pointing in the same direction? Even if we round it to the most vague and nebulous, intuitive sense of a higher power that one might presume is a rough consensus of humanity's hypothetical collective consciousness, that turns out to be not very helpful, especially given there is virtually no content to that consensus about whatever in the world the particular nature of that higher power is supposed to be. It's like having stone tablets from Mount Sinai, but there's nothing on them, aside from maybe "be good" or "stuff matters" at best. And that's assuming it's a real consensus given the prevalence of non-belief in the world, or that human culture around the world represents what individuals would tend to believe on their own if theistic religion hadn't been popular and ubiquitous. In any event, it is a bit like assuming humanity's collective interest in a higher power would entail that our other default overblown desires, like, say, for sugar, necessarily imply some magical place like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, must just have to exist and just no one has found it yet. And not just that having an overblown desire for sugar and other calorie bombs didn't cost our species anything in the wild a million years ago, when calories were scarce and wanting them a great deal was actually an asset to keeping one's intermittently starving self alive. And now that we've arrived in a promised land of calorie paradise, those desire presets get us a host of obesity-related diseases, chronic health issues, and premature death. Some of the top killers of people in the United States today. Incidentally, wanting a higher power and authority that goes beyond the confines of the fabric of the universe and supposedly ensures our everlasting prosperity, in the case of biblical religion at least, gets you a perfect God who is then ideologically forced into a fundamentally misbegotten relationship with an amoral universe, and is disgustingly ultimately responsible for all of the despicable things that happen in this specially created world. And not to mention, we also get the bonus of the untold everlasting horrors that supposedly would await the most of us in a Christian mythological afterlife to make everything right in the end. Perhaps perfection was only ever meant to go with more immutable perfection? Having desires for both greater authority and too many calories makes sense. Going beyond our metaphysical expertise with those desires does not make sense. If you don't trust the traditions and the cultures of other peoples, nations, and entire other continents to have properly discerned the deepest mysteries of the universe, maybe your traditional inheritance and your authorities don't deserve that status either. Historically and pervasively today, people didn't tend to ask the tough questions and live with the better, more honest answers that they might not have preferred. If you are a Christian, especially if surrounded by like-minded Christians your whole life, odds are you haven't even once thought about why someone should call even your God's commands or inherent nature good. Well, guess what? Hardly anyone else in human history did either. And now a whole bunch of human culture has massive undue esteem and leads people astray from the most sound and valid wisdom actually available to them. Humans aren't that good at this as a general rule, or as I said, we'd all be more easily converging on one truth here. Far from it. You have to learn explicitly to check the relevant biases to get this more right than not. If you spent your entire life living a suite of Christian biases, then this may be quite an uphill mental battle for you, and one you are almost completely disinterested in waging. Given it is not at all difficult to tell how the farce of a fake divine authority could happen for different people groups throughout history with thousands of fake gods, it shouldn't be too much trouble, hypothetically, to ratify the logic tools necessary to evaluate Christian claims to having the correct divine authority. And no sooner than this is done, it should be quite evident that the Christian God's moral authority has not at all been properly and sufficiently established for anyone in modern times, and probably not for those in ancient times as well. Even if your Christian explanation for other religious authorities is that they were at least partially inspired by demons, it is still hard to see how you yourself are off the hook for ruling out that Jesus and Yahweh aren't also demons, as I mentioned. If you are avoiding a meritocracy like the plague here, why shouldn't anyone else do the same with their supposed divine authority? A Muslim, a Mormon, a Hindu. You just lost the debate with them. Why shouldn't anyone pick out the bad-sounding things about Christianity, of which there are many, and assume that they were demonically inspired? By which standard could you hold them that you yourself actually have implemented fairly? Shallow religious bias that people take way too seriously is simply not hard to come by or explain in ordinary terms. Having appropriately solid reasons to believe that a particular divine authority is legitimate is really hard to come by, though. In fact, the only way to do that from our perspective for the Christian God is to evaluate the supposed divine revelation, the Bible, as this God's moral resume, and the status of the natural world, the human condition included, as a general indicator for just how much he cares or doesn't care about his creation and in what way, if at all. And yet, these are exactly the battlegrounds, i.e., the problem of evil, where critics of Christianity have traditionally had the upper hand. And that's why these are exactly the debates where it seems most Christians want to pull rank with the divine authority and shut down open discussion so they can feel justified not having the best answers on hand over and above the perspectives of the critics. In my opinion, given the situation, an intellectually honest person would admit their God's Christian authority got established in the same inappropriate way as all the other theistic religions or any other inappropriate authority figures generally speaking, accidents of all too human culture.